The humid air of New Orleans hung thick as molasses over the Beauregard plantation, where the scent of magnolia blossoms couldn't mask the stench of human suffering. Mary wiped the sweat from her brow as she bent over the cotton plants, her calloused hands moving with the mechanical precision born of years under the Louisiana sun. The year 1746 had brought no mercy to the enslaved souls who worked these cursed fields. Thomas Whitmore, the overseer, sat astride his horse like a vulture surveying carrion. His weathered face bore the permanent flush of a man who found his courage at the bottom of a bottle, and his pale eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had long ago traded his humanity for power over the powerless. The leather whip coiled at his side had tasted the blood of every person working these fields. "Move faster, you lazy dogs!" Whitmore's voice cracked like thunder across the plantation. His horse pranced nervously beneath him, sensing the tension that always preceded violence. "The master expects his quota, and by God you'll deliver it or feel my lash." Mary's jaw clenched as she watched him ride past, his gaze lingering on the younger women with predatory intent. She had seen too many disappear into his quarters after dark, returning hollow-eyed and broken. At 28, Mary had survived longer than most by keeping her head down and her rage buried deep. But lately, that rage had been growing like a tumor in her chest. The sun beat down mercilessly as the workers moved through the endless rows of cotton. Children as young as 8 labored alongside their parents, their small fingers bleeding from the sharp bowls. The elderly moved slowly, knowing that any sign of weakness would earn them a beating they might not survive. As evening approached, the workers trudged back to their quarters, ramshackle wooden structures that provided little protection from the elements. Mary shared a cramped room with 3 other women, Sarah, barely 16 and already bearing the scars of Whitmore's attention, Ruth, whose husband had been sold away the previous year, and old Mama Celia, whose wisdom and quiet strength had kept many of them sane through the darkest times. "He's getting worse," Sarah whispered, as they huddled together in the dim light of a single candle. Her voice trembled with barely contained fear. "Last night he said things, terrible things about what he'd do if I didn't." She couldn't finish the sentence. Ruth placed a protective arm around the girl's shoulders. "We got to be smart about this. Can't let him break us all, one by one." Mama Celia's ancient eyes reflected the candlelight as she spoke in her gravelly voice. "Sometimes the Lord tests us beyond what we think we can bear, but he also provides opportunities for those brave enough to take them." Mary felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the chains that had bound not her body but her spirit. She thought of her own daughter, sold away when she was just 5 years old, and of all the others who had suffered under Whitmore's reign of terror. The overseer's cruelty wasn't just random violence, it was a systematic destruction of their humanity, designed to break their spirits so completely that resistance would become unthinkable. Outside, they could hear Whitmore's drunken laughter echoing from the main house, where he often joined the master for evening drinks. The sound made Mary's skin crawl, knowing that soon he would stumble back to his quarters, and the night's true horrors would begin. "He thinks we're animals," Mary said quietly, her voice carrying a steel that made the others look up. "But animals fight back when they're cornered." The candle flickered in the humid air, casting dancing shadows on the walls as the 4 women sat in contemplative silence. Outside, the sounds of the plantation settling into night created a symphony of suffering, muffled sobs from nearby quarters, the rattle of chains, and always, always, the echo of Whitmore's boots on the wooden walkways as he made his rounds like a predator marking his territory. Mary's hand unconsciously moved to the loose floorboard beneath her sleeping mat, where she had hidden a small paring knife stolen from the kitchen months ago. She had told herself it was for protection, but tonight, as she listened to Sarah's quiet weeping and felt the weight of years of accumulated rage, she began to understand that protection might require more than just hiding. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and decay, a fitting perfume for a place where beauty and horror existed side by side. In the distance, the lights of New Orleans twinkled like fallen stars, a reminder of the world beyond the plantation's borders, a world where freedom was more than just a whispered dream. As the others finally drifted into fitful sleep, Mary lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities and consequences. She thought of the stories Mama Celia sometimes told of their ancestors in Africa, warriors who had fought against impossible odds. She thought of the underground networks of resistance that existed even here in the heart of slave territory, where brave souls risked everything to help others find freedom. But mostly, she thought of Thomas Whitmore and the way his eyes went glassy when he drank, and how vulnerable even the most powerful man became when he let his guard down. The seed of an idea began to take root in her mind, dangerous, desperate, but perhaps their only chance at breaking the cycle of abuse that had defined their existence for far too long. The next morning brought no relief from the oppressive heat that seemed to press down on the plantation like the weight of God's judgment. Mary moved through her tasks with mechanical precision, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating and planning. She watched Whitmore with new eyes, studying his patterns, his weaknesses, the rhythm of his daily descent into drunkenness. The overseer's routine was as predictable as the sunrise. He would begin the day with a measure of whiskey to clear his head, then spend the morning riding through the fields, dispensing violence with casual efficiency. By afternoon, the heat and his growing intoxication would drive him to seek shade, where he would continue drinking while the enslaved workers labored under the merciless sun. "Mary, you're quiet today," Ruth observed as they worked side by side in the cotton field. "Quieter than usual, I mean." Mary's hands never stopped moving, but her voice carried a new undertone of determination. "Just thinking about things, about how long we've been living like this." Don't go getting ideas," Ruth warned, glancing nervously toward where Whitmore sat in the shade of a massive oak tree, a jug of rum at his side. "Ideas get people killed around here." But Mary's ideas had already taken root and were growing like kudzu in the fertile soil of her rage. She had noticed that Whitmore's drinking followed a pattern: beer and whiskey during the day, but rum in the evenings, especially when he visited the taverns in the French Quarter. The stronger the drink, the more vulnerable he became. As the day wore on, Mary found herself studying the other workers, wondering who among them might have the courage to stand with her when the time came. There was Big Jim, whose massive frame bore the scars of countless whippings, but whose spirit remained unbroken. There was Samuel, the blacksmith, whose access to tools and knowledge of metalwork could prove invaluable. And there was Mama Celia, whose network of connections throughout the plantation and beyond made her a repository of information and influence. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when Whitmore rose unsteadily from his chair, the empty rum jug rolling away from his feet. His face was flushed red, and his eyes held the glazed look of a man who had crossed the line from drunk to dangerously intoxicated. "Time for my evening constitutional," he announced to no one in particular, his words slurring together. "Going to check on the progress in the quarters. Make sure everyone's comfortable." The way he said the word comfortable made Mary's stomach turn. She knew what his evening visits meant: another night of terror for whichever woman caught his attention, another soul crushed under the weight of his depravity. As Whitmore stumbled toward the slave quarters, Mary made her decision. She caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward Mama Celia's cabin. The girl understood immediately and began making her way there, using the shadows and the confusion of the evening meal preparation to avoid detection. Mary waited until Whitmore had passed, then slipped away from the fields and made her way to the old woman's cabin. Inside, she found Sarah huddled in the corner while Mama Celia sat in her rocking chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Child, "You got that look in your eyes," Mama Celia said without preamble. "The same look your grandmother had when she decided to run north. That's a dangerous look." "Maybe it's time for dangerous," Mary replied, kneeling beside the old woman's chair. "How long are we going to let him destroy us, one by one? How many more girls like Sarah have to suffer before we say enough?" Mama Celia's eyes were sharp despite her age, and Mary could see the wheels turning behind them. "What you thinking about doing, child?" Mary glanced at Sarah, then back at the old woman. "I'm thinking about the stories you tell, about our people who fought back, about the ones who found ways to resist even when resistance seemed impossible." "Those stories don't always have happy endings," Mama Celia warned. "Neither does this," Mary replied, gesturing toward the walls that contained their misery. "At least if we fight back, we die on our feet instead of on our knees." Outside, they could hear Whitmore's voice growing louder as he made his rounds, his drunken laughter punctuated by the sound of doors slamming and muffled cries. The sounds painted a picture of systematic terror that had gone on for far too long. Sarah looked up from her corner, her young face aged beyond her years by trauma. "What can we do? He's got the Master's protection, the law on his side. We're nothing to them." "We're not nothing," Mary said fiercely. "We're human beings, and human beings have the right to defend themselves, even if the law doesn't recognize that right. God does." Mama Celia rocked slowly in her chair, her mind clearly working through possibilities and consequences. Finally, she spoke. "There's ways to fight back that don't involve direct confrontation, ways that have been used before, in other places, other times." "Tell me," Mary said. The old woman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "There's plants that grow in the bayou, plants that can make a man sleep so deep he might not wake up, and there's other plants that can make a man incapacitated in other ways." Mary felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of incapacitated?" "The kind that takes away a man's ability to hurt women the way Whitmore hurts them," Mama Celia said meaningfully. "Permanently." The three women sat in silence as the implications of the old woman's words sank in. Outside, Whitmore's voice was getting closer, and they could hear him trying door handles, looking for his next victim. "It would have to be done carefully," Mama Celia continued, "and it would have to look like an accident, or like something he did to himself in his drunkenness." Mary's hand moved instinctively to the hidden knife beneath her sleeping mat. "What if we combined your way with a more direct approach?" Mama Celia's eyes widened slightly as she understood Mary's meaning. "Child, that's not just dangerous, that's a death sentence if you're caught." "Living like this is already a death sentence," Mary replied. "At least this way, we might save others from suffering the same fate." Sarah looked between the two older women, her eyes reflecting both fear and hope. "If we do this, if we really do this, what happens after?" It was the question that hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. What happened after they struck back? What happened when the Master discovered his overseer's fate? What happened to a plantation full of enslaved people when their act of resistance was discovered? "We deal with that when it comes," Mary said finally. "But first, we stop him from hurting anyone else tonight." The moon hung like a pale witness over the plantation as Mary made her final preparations. In the hours since her conversation with Mama Celia and Sarah, word had spread through the quarters with the silent efficiency of a network forged by necessity and desperation. Not everyone would participate directly, but everyone understood what was at stake. Big Jim had provided crucial intelligence about Whitmore's evening routine. The overseer typically returned from the French Quarter taverns around midnight, stumbling drunk and looking for victims among the enslaved women. His quarters were isolated from the main house, positioned strategically to give him easy access to the slave cabins while maintaining his privacy for the horrors he committed. Samuel the blacksmith had sharpened Mary's hidden knife to a razor's edge, his skilled hands working in the dim light of his forge while keeping watch for any sign of discovery. The blade was small but deadly, designed for precision rather than power. Mama Celia had prepared a mixture of herbs and roots that would ensure Whitmore's unconsciousness would be deep and lasting. The concoction, derived from plants that grew wild in the Louisiana bayous, had been used by her people for generations, sometimes for healing, sometimes for protection, and sometimes for justice. As the night deepened, Mary found herself standing at the crossroads of her life. Behind her lay years of submission, of swallowed rage, of watching helplessly as others suffered. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the possibility of a freedom that might come at the ultimate price. "You sure about this?" Ruth whispered as she approached Mary's hiding spot near Whitmore's quarters. "Once you do this, there's no going back." Mary's grip tightened on the knife hidden beneath her rough cotton dress. "There was no going back the first time he laid hands on one of us. We've just been pretending there was." The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road announced Whitmore's return. He was singing a bawdy tavern song in a voice thick with rum and cruelty, the melody carrying across the still night air like a death knell. Mary pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it could be heard across the plantation. Whitmore's horse knew the way home, even when its rider didn't, and it carried the overseer directly to his quarters with the weary resignation of an animal that had made this journey too many times before. The overseer slid from the saddle with the graceless abandon of the thoroughly intoxicated, nearly falling before catching himself against the hitching post. "Easy there, old boy," he slurred to his horse, patting its neck with unsteady hands. "Tomorrow we'll have some fun with the new girl. The young one with the pretty eyes." Mary's blood turned to ice. He was talking about Sarah. Whitmore stumbled toward his door, fumbling with the key while humming tunelessly. The sound of the lock clicking open seemed unnaturally loud in the still night air. Mary watched as he disappeared inside, leaving the door slightly ajar, a habit born of arrogance and the assumption that no one would dare challenge his authority. She waited, counting her heartbeats, until she heard the familiar sounds of Whitmore preparing for bed, boots hitting the floor, the creak of his chair as he settled in for another drink before sleep. This was the moment Mama Celia had told her to wait for, when his guard would be at its lowest. Moving like a shadow, Mary approached the cabin. Through the crack in the door, she could see Whitmore sitting in his chair, a bottle of rum in his hand, and his eyes already glazing over with the promise of unconsciousness. The room reeked of alcohol, sweat, and something else. Something that spoke of violence and violation. Mary slipped inside, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. Whitmore's head was tilted back, his mouth open as he breathed heavily. The bottle in his hand was nearly empty, and Mary could see that he was teetering on the edge of passing out completely. This was her chance. She moved to his side, her hand steady, despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. The knife felt warm in her palm, as if it had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. Whitmore's breathing was deep and regular, the breathing of a man who had never known fear, who had never imagined that his victims might one day become his judges. Mary thought of Sarah's terrified face, of all the women who had suffered under this man's brutality, of her own daughter sold away to God knew what fate. She thought of the generations of her people who had endured unspeakable horrors, and of the generations yet to come who might be spared if she had the courage to act. The knife moved with surgical precision, guided by years of rage and a determination born of desperation. Whitmore's eyes flew open at the moment of contact, his mouth opening in a scream that never came as shock and alcohol combined to steal his voice. His hands flew to the wound, his face contorting in agony and disbelief. "This is for Sarah," Mary whispered, her voice steady and cold. "This is for all of us." Whitmore tried to rise from his chair, but the combination of alcohol, shock, and blood loss sent him crashing to the floor. His eyes, wide with terror and pain, fixed on Mary's face as understanding dawned. For the first time in his life, Thomas Whitmore was completely powerless, completely at the mercy of someone he had considered less than human. Mary stood over him, the bloody knife still in her hand, and felt something she had never experienced before, the intoxicating rush of justice served by her own hand. But she also felt the weight of what she had done, the knowledge that this single act would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone on the plantation. Whitmore's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid, his face pale as death. Mary knelt beside him, close enough to see the fear in his eyes, close enough to smell the rum on his breath mixed with the metallic scent of blood. "You're going to live," she told him quietly. "But you're never going to hurt another woman again. Never." She left him there, writhing in agony on the floor of his cabin, and slipped back into the night. Behind her, she could hear his weak attempts to call for help, but she knew that by the time anyone found him, it would be too late to undo what she had done. The deed was finished, but Mary understood that this was not an ending. It was a beginning. The real test would come with the dawn, when the plantation woke to discover what had happened to their overseer, and when the consequences of her actions would begin to unfold like a storm gathering on the horizon. The first light of dawn crept across the plantation like a reluctant witness to the night's events. Mary had not slept. Instead, she had spent the dark hours preparing for what was to come. She had cleaned the knife and hidden it in a new location, washed away any trace of blood from her hands and clothing, and rehearsed the story she would tell when the inevitable questions came. The alarm was raised just after sunrise, when Whitmore failed to appear for his morning rounds. Big Jim, who had been assigned to tend the overseer's horse, discovered the cabin door still ajar and Whitmore unconscious on the floor in a pool of his own blood. The blacksmith's shouts brought workers running from across the plantation, and soon a crowd had gathered outside the overseer's quarters. Master Beauregard arrived within minutes, his face flushed with anger and confusion. He was a thin, nervous man who relied heavily on Whitmore's brutality to maintain control over his human property. The sight of his overseer lying helpless and mutilated clearly shook him to his core. "What happened here?" Beauregard demanded, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "Who did this?" The enslaved workers exchanged glances, but no one spoke. Mary stood among them, her face a mask of carefully constructed shock and concern. Inside, her heart was racing, but years of survival had taught her to hide her true emotions behind whatever expression the situation required. Dr. Rousseau, the plantation's physician, arrived shortly after and immediately set to work examining Whitmore. The overseer was conscious but delirious with pain and blood loss, his attempts to speak coming out as incoherent mumbles. The doctor's face grew increasingly grim as he assessed the damage. "He'll live," Dr. Rousseau announced finally, "but the injury is severe, permanent. He'll never be the same man he was." Beauregard's face went white. "You mean..." "I mean exactly what you think I mean," the doctor replied curtly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't random violence, this was surgical precision." The master's eyes swept over the assembled workers, searching for any sign of guilt or satisfaction. Mary kept her expression neutral, but she could feel the weight of his gaze when it fell on her. She had always been one of the more intelligent and observant workers, and she knew that would make her a natural suspect. "I want to know who did this," Beauregard said, his voice rising to a shout. "Someone here knows something, and by God, I'll get it out of them if I have to whip every last one of you." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mary knew that Beauregard was capable of following through on his promise. The master's cruelty was more calculated than Whitmore's, but no less real. The question was whether anyone would break under pressure and reveal what they knew or suspected. Mama Celia stepped forward, her aged frame somehow commanding respect even in this moment of crisis. "Master Beauregard, sir, we all been in our quarters all night. Ain't nobody seen nothing unusual." Is that so? Beauregard's eyes narrowed. Then how do you explain this? Whitmore didn't do this to himself. Maybe he did, Big Jim said quietly, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. Man drinks as much as he does. Maybe he had an accident. Maybe he fell on something sharp. Dr. Rousseau shook his head. This wasn't an accident. The wound is too clean, too precise. Someone with knowledge of anatomy did this. Mary felt a chill run down her spine. She had been careful, but perhaps not careful enough. The doctor's words suggested that he understood exactly what had been done and how it had been accomplished. I want this plantation searched, Beauregard ordered. Every cabin, every hiding place. If there's a weapon, I want it found. And I want everyone questioned separately. Someone will talk. As the master's men began their search, Mary found herself thinking about the knife hidden in its new location. She had chosen the spot carefully, a place where it would be difficult to find but easy to retrieve if necessary. But she also knew that determined searchers might eventually uncover it, and when they did, her fate would be sealed. The questioning began immediately, with Beauregard and his overseer's assistant taking workers aside one by one. Mary watched as her friends and fellow sufferers were subjected to increasingly aggressive interrogation, their faces reflecting the fear that had become their constant companion. When her turn came, Mary was led to the main house and seated in Beauregard's study, a room that reeked of tobacco and privilege. The master sat behind his massive oak desk, his pale eyes studying her with the intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. "Mary," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "you've been on this plantation longer than most. You see everything, hear everything. What do you know about what happened to Whitmore?" Mary met his gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I know he was hurt bad, Master. But I don't know how it happened. I was in my cabin all night, sleeping." "Were you?" Beauregard leaned forward. "Because, Doctor, Rousseau tells me that whoever did this had knowledge of human anatomy. You've helped with births, haven't you? Tended to the sick." The trap was closing, but Mary had anticipated this line of questioning. "Yes, sir, I have. But helping bring babies into the world ain't the same as hurting folks. I wouldn't know how to do something like what happened to Mr. Whitmore." Beauregard studied her for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. "You know, Mary, I've always thought you were smarter than you let on. Smarter and more dangerous. I'm just trying to survive, Master. Same as everyone else." "Survival," Beauregard repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose that's what this is all about. Someone decided that their survival required Whitmore's incapacitation." Mary said nothing, but she could feel the master's suspicion like a physical weight pressing down on her. She knew that he suspected her, but suspicion wasn't proof, and without proof, even a master's power had limits. The interrogation continued for what felt like hours, with Beauregard probing and testing, looking for any crack in Mary's story. But she had lived her entire life under the scrutiny of those who held power over her, and she had learned to hide her thoughts and feelings behind a mask of compliance. Finally, Beauregard dismissed her with a warning that the investigation would continue. As Mary walked back to the quarters, she could feel the eyes of the other workers on her, some filled with admiration, others with fear of what her actions might bring down on all of them. The plantation had changed overnight, and everyone could feel it. The balance of power had shifted, if only slightly, and the consequences of that shift were yet to be fully understood. Mary had struck a blow for justice, but she had also opened a door that could never be closed again. 3 days had passed since the attack on Whitmore, and the plantation simmered with tension like a pot about to boil over. The overseer remained bedridden, his condition stable, but his spirit broken. Word of his fate had spread beyond the plantation's borders, carried by the invisible network of communication that connected the enslaved communities throughout Louisiana. Mary noticed the change immediately. Workers from neighboring plantations looked at her differently when they encountered her at the market in town, some with fear, others with something that might have been respect. The story was growing in the telling, becoming legend even as the truth remained hidden. Master Beauregard had brought in a temporary overseer, a hard man named Crawford who carried himself with the swagger of someone trying to prove his worth through cruelty. But even Crawford seemed unsettled by the atmosphere on the plantation, glancing nervously at the workers and jumping at unexpected sounds. "They're scared," Ruth observed as she and Mary worked side by side in the cotton fields. "All of them. They don't know who did it, but they know it could happen again." Mary kept her voice low, aware that ears were always listening. "Fear can be a weapon, but it can also be a trap. We have to be careful not to let it consume us." The investigation had stalled, much to Beauregard's frustration. The weapon had not been found, despite extensive searches. No one had broken under questioning, and the wall of silence among the workers remained unbreached. But Mary knew that the master's patience was wearing thin, and desperate men often resorted to desperate measures. That evening, as the workers gathered for their meager supper, Mama Celia approached Mary with news that made her blood run cold. "Child, you need to know something," the old woman whispered. "Words come from town. Master Beauregard's been talking to the authorities. He's thinking about bringing in the law." Mary's stomach dropped. Local law enforcement was notoriously brutal in their treatment of enslaved people, and their methods of extracting confessions made Beauregard's interrogations seem gentle by comparison. "When?" Mary asked. "Soon. Maybe tomorrow. He's getting pressure from the other plantation owners. They're worried that what happened here might give their own people ideas." Mary understood the implications immediately. Her act of resistance had sent ripples throughout the region's slave-owning community, and they were closing ranks to prevent the spread of what they saw as a dangerous contagion. The punishment, when it came, would be designed not just to punish the guilty, but to terrorize the innocent. "There's something else," Mama Celia continued. "There's been talk among some of the others, talk about running." The word hung in the air between them like a loaded pistol. Running meant the Underground Railroad, the network of safe houses and brave souls who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North, but it also meant leaving behind everything and everyone they had ever known, with no guarantee of success and the certainty of death if they were caught. "Who's talking?" Mary asked. "Big Jim for one, Samuel, a few others. They figure if the law comes, we're all going to suffer whether we're guilty or not. Might as well take our chances on the road." Mary felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Her actions had set events in motion that were now beyond her control, and others would pay the price for her choices. The question was whether she could live with that knowledge, or whether she had an obligation to see this through to whatever end awaited. "What about you?" Mary asked. "Would you go?" Mama Celia's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Child, I'm too old to run and too stubborn to hide. But you got a choice to make. You can stay and face whatever's coming, or you can take your chances on freedom." That night, Mary lay awake listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into uneasy sleep. Through the thin walls of her cabin, she could hear whispered conversations as others grappled with the same impossible choice she faced. Stay and risk capture, torture, and death, or run and risk capture, torture, and death on the road to an uncertain freedom. The decision was complicated by more than just personal survival. If she ran, it would be seen as an admission of guilt, and Beauregard's wrath would fall on those left behind. But if she stayed, there was no guarantee that her sacrifice would protect anyone else. As dawn approached, Mary made her choice. She would stay, not out of resignation, but out of a determination to see this through to its conclusion. She had struck the first blow in what might become a larger struggle, and she would not abandon that fight now. But she would not go down without ensuring that others had the chance to escape the consequences of her actions. If Big Jim and the others wanted to run, she would help them. It was the least she could do for those who had supported her when she needed it most. The next morning brought news that confirmed Mama Celia's warnings. A contingent of local law enforcement had arrived at the plantation, led by Sheriff Boudreaux, a man whose reputation for brutality was legendary, even in a region where violence against enslaved people was commonplace. Mary watched from the fields as the sheriff and his men set up their operations in the main house. She could see Beauregard gesturing animatedly as he spoke with them, his face flushed with the excitement of a man who believed justice was finally within reach. "This is it," Big Jim said quietly as he worked beside her. "Tonight, after they settle in. You coming with us?" Mary shook her head. "I can't, but I can help you get away clean." "Mary," Jim's voice was heavy with concern. "You know what they'll do to you if they figure out it was you." "I know," Mary replied, "but someone has to stay and face the music. Might as well be the one who started the song." As the day wore on, Mary finalized her plans. She would create a distraction that would allow the others to escape while drawing attention to herself. It was a desperate gambit, but it was the only way she could see to protect those who had stood with her while maintaining some measure of control over her own fate. The sun was setting when Sheriff Boudreaux began his interrogations, and Mary knew that her time was running out. Soon, the sheriff's methods would break someone, and when they did, all the careful planning in the world wouldn't save her. But she had one more card to play, one final act of defiance that would ensure her story lived on long after she was gone. The legend of the slave who castrated the overseer was already spreading, but Mary intended to give it an ending that would inspire others to resist, no matter the cost. Sheriff Boudreaux's interrogation methods made Beauregard's questioning seem like gentle conversation. The screams that echoed from the main house throughout the day served as a grim reminder of what awaited anyone suspected of involvement in Whitmore's mutilation. By evening, 2 workers had been beaten unconscious and a third had been permanently crippled, but still no one had confessed. Mary watched the proceedings from her position in the fields, her heart heavy with the knowledge that innocent people were suffering for her actions. But she also saw something else in the faces of her fellow workers, a hardening resolve, a recognition that they were all in this together regardless of individual guilt or innocence. As darkness fell, Mary put her plan into motion. She had spent the day preparing, gathering materials, and positioning them strategically around the plantation. Her goal was simple: create enough chaos to allow Big Jim and the others to escape, while ensuring that she would be caught in a way that left no doubt about her guilt. The first fire started in the cotton storage barn, a blaze that would be visible for miles and would draw every available person to fight it. Mary had soaked the cotton bales with lamp oil stolen from the main house, ensuring that the fire would spread quickly and burn hot enough to be impossible to ignore. As shouts of "Fire!" rang out across the plantation, Mary made her way to Whitmore's cabin. The overseer was still bedridden, tended by a slave woman who had been pressed into service as his nurse. Mary waited until the woman ran to help fight the fire, then slipped inside. Whitmore's eyes widened with terror when he saw her. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "You... it was you." "Yes," Mary said simply, settling into the chair beside his bed. "It was me." "Why?" The word was barely audible, but Mary heard the genuine confusion in it. "Because someone had to," she replied. "Because you were destroying us one by one, and no one else was going to stop you." Outside, the sounds of chaos grew louder as more buildings caught fire. Mary had set multiple blazes, ensuring that the plantation's firefighting efforts would be spread too thin to be effective. The orange glow visible through the cabin's windows painted everything in hellish light. The others, Whitmore gasped. Did they help you? Mary shook her head. This was my choice, my action. No one else is responsible for what I did to you. She could hear footsteps approaching the cabin and knew that her time was up. Sheriff Boudreau burst through the door, his face blackened with smoke and his eyes wild with fury. Behind him came two of his deputies, their hands already reaching for their weapons. Well, well, Boudreau said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Mary's skin crawl. Looks like we found our culprit. Mary stood slowly, her hands visible and empty. Sheriff, Mary, isn't it? Boudreau stepped closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Master Beauregard told me you were the smart one, smart enough to plan something like this, smart enough to know when enough is enough, Mary replied. The sheriff's backhanded blow sent her sprawling to the floor, but she made no attempt to fight back or flee. This was how it had to end, with her capture, her confession, and her punishment serving as both justice and inspiration for others who might follow in her footsteps. You're going to tell me everything, Boudreau said, hauling her to her feet. Who helped you? Who knew about it? Who's been covering for you? Mary met his gaze steadily. There's nothing to tell. I acted alone. Another blow, harder this time, split her lip and sent blood streaming down her chin. But Mary's resolve didn't waver. She had made her choice, and she would see it through to the end. We'll see about that, Boudreau snarled. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be begging to tell me everything you know. As the sheriff's men dragged her from the cabin, Mary caught a glimpse of the plantation burning around them. The fires she had set were doing their work, consuming the symbols of oppression and creating enough confusion to mask the escape of those who had chosen to run. In the distance, she thought she saw figures moving through the smoke toward the bayou, where boats waited to carry them to the first stop on their journey to freedom. The interrogation that followed was everything Mary had expected, and worse. Sheriff Boudreau employed methods that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud, but Mary's story never changed. She had acted alone, motivated by years of abuse and a desire to protect others from Whitmore's cruelty. No one had helped her, no one had known of her plans, and no one else bore responsibility for her actions. By dawn, Mary was barely conscious, her body broken, but her spirit intact. She had given the others the time they needed to escape, and she had protected them from the consequences of her choices. It was enough. Master Beauregard arrived as the sun rose over the smoldering ruins of his plantation. Half his buildings were gone, his overseer was permanently disabled, and his most valuable worker was confessing to crimes that would see her executed. The financial losses alone would take years to recover from, but the psychological impact was even greater. Why? Beauregard asked, echoing Whitmore's earlier question. Why destroy everything? Mary looked up at him through swollen eyes, her voice barely a whisper, but her words carrying the weight of generations of suffering. Because sometimes destruction is the only way to clear the ground for something better to grow. The master's face went white with rage, but before he could respond, Sheriff Boudreau intervened. She'll hang for this, he said. Public execution, as an example to others who might get similar ideas. Mary nodded slowly. She had expected nothing less. But as they dragged her away to await her fate, she felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of completion, of having lived her life on her own terms rather than those imposed by others. The legend of the slave who castrated the overseer was about to become the legend of the slave who burned down the plantation and died unrepentant. It was a story that would spread throughout the South, inspiring some and terrifying others, but never forgotten. The execution was scheduled for the following week, to be held in the public square of New Orleans as a warning to any who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. But Mary's story had already begun to take on a life of its own, spreading through the underground networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. In the days leading up to her execution, Mary was held in the parish jail, a fetid stone building that reeked of despair and human waste. But even in this place of hopelessness, she found herself at the center of something larger than herself. Visitors came, some openly, others in secret, to hear her story firsthand. Mama Celia was among the first, her aged frame somehow managing to navigate the bureaucratic obstacles that should have kept her away. She sat across from Mary in the dim visiting room, her weathered hands folded in her lap, and her eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "The others made it," she said quietly. "Big Jim, Samuel, 3 others. They're safe, heading north on the railroad." Mary felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Good, that's good." "There's more," Mama Celia continued. "Words spreading about what you did, not just here but everywhere. Plantations as far away as Mississippi and Alabama are talking about the slave woman who fought back." "And what are they saying?" The old woman's smile was fierce. "They're saying that if one woman could stand up to them, maybe others can too. They're saying that maybe it's time to stop accepting what can't be changed and start changing what can't be accepted." Mary understood the implications. Her act of individual resistance was becoming something larger, a symbol of the possibility that the enslaved could fight back against their oppressors. It was both inspiring and terrifying, knowing that her death might spark the very rebellion that the authorities were trying to prevent. Other visitors followed, free blacks from New Orleans who risked their own safety to show solidarity, white abolitionists who saw in Mary's story a powerful weapon in their fight against slavery. Even some enslaved people from other plantations who somehow managed to slip away long enough to pay their respects to the woman who had done what they only dreamed of doing. Each visitor carried Mary's story back to their own communities, where it grew and evolved in the telling. Some versions emphasized her surgical precision in castrating Whitmore, others focused on her defiant burning of the plantation. All of them captured the essential truth that a woman who had been treated as property had reclaimed her humanity through an act of violent resistance. The authorities were not blind to what was happening. Sheriff Boudreaux increased security around the jail, and Master Beauregard petitioned the governor to move the execution to a more private venue. But the damage was already done. Mary's story had escaped their control, and no amount of official suppression could put it back in the bottle. On the morning of her execution, Mary was awakened by the sound of crowds gathering in the square outside her cell. She had expected a mob baying for her blood, but the sounds she heard were more complex. Anger, yes, but also something that might have been support. Father Dubois, the parish priest, came to offer last rites. He was a thin, nervous man who clearly disapproved of Mary's actions, but felt obligated to tend to her spiritual needs. As he spoke the familiar words of absolution, Mary found herself thinking not of salvation, but of the legacy she was leaving behind. "Do you repent of your sins, my child?" Father Dubois asked. Mary considered the question seriously. "I repent of the necessity that drove me to them, Father, but not of the actions themselves." The priest's face tightened with disapproval, but he completed the ritual nonetheless. As he prepared to leave, Mary stopped him with a question. "Father, will you remember my story? Will you tell it truly, not as the authorities want it told, but as it really happened?" Father Dubois hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to the church and his recognition of the injustices that had driven Mary to her desperate act. Finally, he nodded. "I will remember, child, and I will tell it as you lived it." The walk to the gallows was a journey through a sea of faces, some hostile, others sympathetic, all of them recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. Mary held her head high, refusing to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her broken or afraid. The executioner was a professional, efficient, and dispassionate. As he placed the noose around her neck, Mary looked out over the crowd and saw faces she recognized. Enslaved people who had somehow managed to be present for her final moments, their eyes reflecting a mixture of grief and determination. Sheriff Boudreaux read the charges and the sentence, his voice carrying across the square with official authority. But Mary barely heard the words. Instead, she was thinking of Sarah, safe now in some northern city where she could live without fear. She was thinking of Big Jim and Samuel and the others, carrying her story with them as they built new lives in freedom. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked, the question more ritual than genuine inquiry. Mary looked out over the crowd, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I am not the first, and I will not be the last. Remember that when you think you have broken us completely." The trapdoor opened, and Mary fell into history. But her story did not end with her death. Within hours, accounts of her final words were spreading through the underground networks that connected the enslaved communities of the South. Within days, her story had reached the North, where abolitionists seized upon it as proof of the inherent injustice of slavery. The legend of Mary, the slave who castrated the overseer and burned down the plantation, became a rallying cry for resistance. Some versions of the story were embellished, others simplified, but all of them carried the essential message that even the most powerless could strike back against their oppressors if they had the courage to act. Master Beauregard never fully recovered from the events at his plantation. The financial losses from the fires, combined with the psychological impact of Mary's resistance, broke his spirit. He sold what remained of his property and moved north, leaving Louisiana forever. Thomas Whitmore lived for another 20 years, but he was never the same man who had terrorized the plantation's enslaved population. His physical disability was matched by a psychological trauma that left him jumping at shadows and flinching at unexpected sounds. He died alone and unmourned, a broken reminder of the price of cruelty. But Mary's legacy lived on. In the years that followed, her story inspired countless acts of resistance, both large and small. Some enslaved people found the courage to escape, others to resist their masters' worst abuses. The Underground Railroad reported an increase in refugees from Louisiana plantations, many of whom cited Mary's example as their inspiration. The story spread beyond the enslaved communities, reaching sympathetic whites who were moved by the tale of a woman driven to desperate measures by systematic abuse. Abolitionists used Mary's story in their speeches and writings, arguing that slavery inevitably produced such violence by denying basic human dignity to its victims. Years later, when the Civil War finally brought an end to slavery in America, Mary's story was remembered as one of the sparks that had helped ignite the fire of resistance. Historians would debate the details, and some would question whether one woman's act of violence had really made a difference in the larger struggle for freedom. But in the communities where her story was first told, there was no doubt about Mary's significance. She had shown that resistance was possible, that even the most powerless could strike back against injustice. Her legacy was written not in official records, but in the hearts and minds of those who refused to accept that their humanity could be bought and sold. The slave who castrated the overseer while he was drunk had become something more than a woman seeking justice. She had become a symbol of the unbreakable human spirit, a reminder that freedom is not something that can be given or taken away, but something that must be claimed by those brave enough to fight for it. In the end, Mary's story was not just about one woman's act of resistance, but about the power of individual courage to inspire collective action. Her legacy lived on in every act of defiance, every escape to freedom, every refusal to accept the unacceptable. She had lit a fire that would burn until slavery itself was consumed in the flames of its own contradictions. The legend of Mary would be told and retold for generations, a testament to the truth that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful, can ultimately defeat the human desire for dignity and freedom. Her story became part of the larger narrative of resistance that would eventually bring down the institution of slavery itself, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is the courage of a single individual willing to say,